we now move on to taking a look at the dangerous King's Gambit. Clearly this is an opening which has to be respected and is still being used at the highest level. Why, in the last 18 months I've seen players of excellence of Magnus Carlsen use it, Nigel Short continues to use it, and I've even seen Nakamura use it. And if these volatile grandmasters are employing the King's Gambit, then it is still a worthy prospect. On this DVD I'm going to concentrate on a response which is fairly simple to understand and execute in keeping with the theme of this repertoire. And my suggestion starts with the move D5, the Forkbeer counter gambit. The nice thing about the Forkbeer is it tends to force white to play e takes D5, as other moves give him absolutely nothing. It's worth noting at this early stage that f takes e5 is catastrophic for white, and in fact loses the game after queen h4 check. Well, should lose the game. So, back to d5, e takes d5, and now here comes our little surprise. The normal move in the Forkbeer is to go e4 here, or even c6, the Nimzovich counter gambit, but I recommend e takes f4. This is a very useful transpositional device. Going back into, let's see, another line, let's go back to f4. Black takes on f4. Now, white can play the bishop's gambit here, bishop c4. And if black went d5 in this position, then bishop takes d5 is quite a good move. And again, is being played at a high level. The nice thing about our move order is that by forcing white to take on d5 at this early stage, we've avoided that awkward variation of the bishop's gambit. And in fact, what we've gone back into is the d5 line of the king's knight's gambit, where with black threatening queen h4 check here, white's more or less got to go knight f3, and now black goes knight f6, and we're back in what we want. I've always felt the d5 variation to be very thematic for black. Black opens up the game at the earliest stage. He's got free flowing development for all his pieces, which is exactly what we want. And yeah, this is quite a good line for black. The biggest danger to black is that, well, white's got extra central pawns, and white can use these pawns in the middle game to try and push the active black minor pieces back. So that's the danger that black has got to be aware of when he plays this system. Now I'm going to show you some games which hopefully will nullify white's ideas, and the first of these comes from the Sydney Open, played in April 2012, between Multhon Lee, who's grades 2402, I imagine he's an international master, and Leventi Vaidya, whose grade is 2597, so I imagine he is a grandmaster. And in this game, Lee played the modern move, bishop c4. That's the move recommended by Gallagher in books on the King's Gambit, and has more or less superseded bishop b5 check in this position as white's main move. Obviously we'll be taking a look bishop b5 check in future cuts. But after bishop c4, black sticks with the orthodox knight takes d5, and already I quite like black's position. The main line suggests that white should surrender the bishop pair here with bishop takes d5, but I don't consider this to be particularly dangerous to black. We're going to see a game of Michael Adams a bit later on, where after knight c3, which is a fairly obvious move, he puts his queen on f5 and absolutely crushes a guy called Robert Eames in the British Championship 2010. There, later on, after developing his pieces, black managed to launch a kingside pawn storm against the white king. So presumably, going back to Lee versus Vaidya, that's why white castles in this position, trying to avoid that variation. Knight c6 was played, and only now did white play knight c3. And I presume there is some move order trick for white if black plays queen f5 here, so Vaidya decided to put his queen on h5. White played queen e2 check, and black plays bishop e6. So no problem whatsoever with initial development. We're getting all our pieces out very quickly. It seems to me that black can castle on either side. He's also got a possible plan, if he castles on the queen side, of actually getting this kingside pawn storm together. d4. Let's also not forget that white has yet to regain his pawn. White's still a pawn down in this position. And whilst the pawn on f4 is not a particularly strong pawn, it does stop the white pieces from coming out to their best squares. So white had better get his pawn back quickly. Well, Vaidya castles. Okay, this is a common sense idea, just giving white back his pawn in order to complete development. Classical chess. Please note that due to the unprotected black queen on h5, knight takes d4 was not yet possible. White just takes, and black cannot recapture due to the fact that his queen is attacked. So bishop b4, the black pieces are streaming out. And already I slightly prefer black's game. He's got two bishops. He's putting pressure on white's position. There are definite ideas of rook h e8 there, putting pressure on the white queen. White's got to be very concrete here if he wants to develop any play. So that's why Lee plays knight b5, hitting c7, which black protects with bishop a5. And now white starts to get those central pawns rolling. I mentioned at the outset, this is probably the main theme behind white's play in this line. Well, black's main theme is rapid, pointed development. So rook h8 points the finger at the white queen. So the white queen steps aside. All very logical so far. a6. Well, of course, if the white knight moves, then d4 drops. So white's got to enter a tactical sequence here after d5. Black took the white knight. And now, of course, the problem for white is that if he takes on c6 here, then the c4 pawn is hanging. And perhaps the best way for black to exploit that is to go queen c5 check first. And I think that will win a pawn in broad daylight. So white didn't like that, and he took the bishop on e6, whereupon black took back. White took on b5, black recaptured. White took on h7, it's all getting very tactical, and black took on b2. So the smoke is starting to clear. White played bishop g5, black played rook d8, and black is a pawn up. Admittedly, there are open files on the queen side towards his king, but I think I'd much rather be black in this position, a pawn up, with no real danger to the king, than in white's position. Well, white played queen f5, and decent move, bringing the queen up, hitting that pawn on f7, and black decided to play knight e5 in this position. King h1. Well, clearly white was getting afraid of ideas such as bishop b6 check. And of course, if knight takes e5 in this position, well, this is quite a nice position for black. We can recapture with the queen, and white still can't take on f7. So white parks his king in the corner, away from tactics, and black plays g6. Another interesting and tactically motivated move. Queen f4 was answered by knight takes f3, and now white is struggling to find a good reply. Basically, I think if white recaptures with the queen here, then we've got f5, which is a good move, and, well, tends to nullify white's attack. So white took with the pawn, but now came f6. Queen a4, and now queen b4. Another sensible move, forcing off the queens. And suddenly, white basically has a lost position here. I mean, he ends up a pawn down for nothing. White's king is also in a worse position for the endgame, so black plays rook e1 quite naturally, just intending to swap off all the pieces. It's very, very simple now. When you're winning, you don't take risks. Well, white just enters a completely lost bishop endgame. He's got to keep the bishops on. Black brings his king up. And that was the last move of the game. When you're playing a grandmaster, these positions really shouldn't be played on. This is going to be child's play for the grandmaster. He's just going to find some way of exploiting that passed pawn on c7. So just to recap and summarise, so far, against the King's Gambit, I'm recommending that black employ a move order trick, going in via the fork beer to force white to play e takes d5, and then to play the free-flowing e takes f4. This will form the basis of our approach. In the last video, we saw a very interesting move order against the King's Gambit. Black first employs the fork beer move order, more or less forcing white to play e takes d5, and then he goes e takes f4. A very useful transpositional device which avoids certain awkward lines of the bishop's gambit. Well, we're now going to look at another game in this line between Ian Snape and Adrian Demuth. The black player is an international master with a grade of 2,442, and this game was played in the Hastings Masters in January 2012. In view of black's immediate threat of queen to h4 check here, white's reply knight f3 is almost forced. And now we get a main line very similar to our first example, where white brings his bishop out to c4. There is another move here, bishop b5 check. We'll be dealing with that next. Black fluently takes on d5. And now in our next game, this game, actually white castles. He doesn't take the knight off on d5. Well, against this, I think black has two good moves. Demuth played is a good one, bishop to e6. Black can also play bishop to e7 in this position. That's quite reasonable. And usually white goes d4, black castles, and then white gets his pawn back, something like this. Takes, and takes on f4. Black plays queen d8. I think this position is also reasonable for black. Probably takes a little bit of care to play it, although black's got two nice bishops. This is perfectly playable. It's not so easy for white to work up an advantage here, but he does have the open f-file. Going back to Snape Demuth, bishop e6, well, shores up the knight on d5, blocks the e-file. In every respect, it's a good move, and might set up ideas such as the sudden and surprising move knight e3, which could nab the two bishops. So that's why white goes bishop b3 in this game, taking away black's tactics, and only now does black play bishop e7. So just to repeat, the main danger to black in this position is an advance of the central pawns by white, which could cause black's minor pieces some confusion. But as long as black's ready to answer c4 with knight e3, I mean, we actually see this in action. If white goes d4, black can castle in this position. White goes c4. Well, here, I think black is ready to plunge his knight in. He almost certainly knows he's going to lose that pawn on e3, but again, in return, he's going to get two nice bishops. He's also going to get some pressure on the dark squares, because now the bishop on e7 has suddenly become a very strong piece. If white tries to continually interrupt the flow of black's game, then he can fall into difficulty. And one way to do this after d5 would be to play bishop c5. That immediately threatens e2 check, winning the queen, so white's probably got to play queen e2. And then just simple development will do, something like bishop g4 pinning, queen e7 stopping white from going knight e4, knight d7, something like this. White moves in to regain his pawn and black doesn't let him. This will be a typical move sequence in this variation, by which black gets a very comfortable game. So going back to Snape versus Demuth, white plays c4 straight away. And we can understand his motivation for that. He simply doesn't want to let the knight into e3. But of course, after knight b6, we note that suddenly this pawn is under fire on c4. And in fact, Snape lets this pawn go. Now, the thing is, white doesn't really want to go playing a move like d3 in this position. I mean, that is a very, very passive move, and it makes this bishop on b3 look very bad. You know, black has two ways to play this position. He can just concentrate his fire on d4 here, maybe play a move like c5 and knight c6. He can even play the very combative move g5 here. White's playing so slowly that black can maybe go in for this. And suddenly this is a very difficult position for white. So going back to Snape versus Demuth, this is why white gambited the pawn with d4. Black was happy to take it, and now knight to c3. This is a typical King's Gambit solution to the problem. Instead of going passive, white goes active. He introduces the threat of d5 into the bishop, which is going to win a piece. And basically, he's just going to hope to get this pawn back and get a nice active game. Well, Demuth played knight d6. White took on e6 and played queen to e2. And now black played a pragmatic move, castles. Basically, this is a classic way to treat gambits. You give back the material you have gained to get a good position. In this case, black gives up the e-pawn, tuck his king away in the corner, and then he says to white, well, what have you got here? Well, Snape moves in with the knight, a double attack on the bishop and the pawn at f4. Black defends the knight with the pawn, the bishop with the knight, and now white goes bishop takes f4. So the position's starting to clarify. Black has given both the pawns he gained back in order to get a good game. And now he starts to concentrate his fire on the pawn at d4. A very sharp move, because Demuth has calculated that he can allow this move, knight takes c7. At first sight, this looks extremely scary after bishop takes d6. But black's point is that he plays a sudden and surprising move, knight takes d4. Now this is quite interesting. Probably after long thought, white went knight takes d4. Now he can try the desperado move here, queen takes f6. And then I think black should continue knight takes f3 check. Now white has two moves, but neither of them give the advantage. If he goes queen takes f3, that's just a serious mistake. Black goes queen b6 check and wins. So better for white after knight takes f3 check is to tuck the king away in the corner, and then we get the sequence rook takes f6, bishop takes c7, and now another little intermezzo by black, rook to c8. Obviously black gets a slightly better rook endgame if white plays rook takes f3, so white retains his bishop. Now knight g5, and you would think perhaps that white could build up a small edge here, but it's very difficult. If black plays accurately, he moves his rook into c4 with ideas of rook a4. If b3 we go rook c6, and it's very, very difficult for white to claim any advantage whatsoever. In fact, I imagine this will be a draw. Black's nicely centralised and gets ready to move his king over to f7 and then rook to c2. So, Snape had plenty to think about. He went knight takes d4. Black took on d4 check. King went into the corner. Black got rid of his difficulty with rook takes f1 check. Rook takes f1, queen c6, and after rook e1, bishop takes b2. The smoke was clearing, and black was still a pawn up. Both sides gave their king a bit of air, and white played bishop g3. I mean, essentially, this is a normal position with black a pawn up. It's the type of endgame we had earlier, but black has an extra pawn. Snape seeks refuge in a rook endgame. Of course, black is happy to take. Rook b8, and now the theatre of action will be on the queen side. White is struggling to contain black. Black will create a passed pawn on the queen side and hopefully win the game as a result. After rook e7, black played a6, rook a7, and now rook b6. And white started to bring his king across. Now rook c6 was answered by a3, and black brought his king up. White played g3. Black fixed the pawns on the king side. King h3, and now king f6. White seems to have found an uncomfortable box for his king. Of course, the problem is the king could not move out because there was a check on c2 to worry about. So g6, rook f8 check king e5, rook f4, rook b6, getting ready to create that passed pawn. That is the overall aim. And after king f3, a mistake, probably prompted by time trouble, rook f6 won the game. Just going back to a5, difficult for white to do better because black's just going to go b4, and that will be that really. You're threatening to push the pawn all the way down. White will probably have to move his rook across to b1, and then the black king moves in, as the black king is closer to the passed pawn than the white king. So just to summarise our initial thoughts on the king's gambit, we're playing a tricky move order, the fork beer, looks good, and now e takes f4, threatening queen h4 check. We've seen lines, modern lines, where white's going bishop c4. I mean, that's more or less what they all do these days. It superseded the move bishop b5, check, which is the old-fashioned move. But there seems no reason why black shouldn't be perfectly okay here with a straightforward knight takes d5.